Okay, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So hello again, and welcome to Taste of Science. Our event is Understanding Consciousness from Human Research to Artificial Intelligence. As I said, my name is Genevieve. I'm a graduate student at Drexel University, and I'm a volunteer with the Philadelphia chapter of Taste of Science, and I'll be hosting and moderating the event tonight. So to begin, I just want to thank our speakers, Dr. Martin Monti and Dr. Slobodan Vucetic. I want to thank Taste of Science and, of course, everyone for joining us. So Taste of Science is a nonprofit, and we're dedicated to connecting non-scientists with scientific research to promote science policy and education. Our annual event typically takes place in person at bars and restaurants in cities all around the country, and we invite leading researchers to present their research to the general public. While we wait to have our events safely in person again, we're hosting our events virtually. If you're interested in donating to Taste of Science so that we can continue to host these kinds of events, you can visit tasteofscience.org/donate, which should be dropped into the chat at some point tonight. Tonight's festival event is hosted by us at Taste of Science Philadelphia. This evening's event is going to focus on how the brain creates conscious experiences, what we know about human consciousness and the interplay between human consciousness and artificial intelligence. We'll have 2 short talks followed by a panel style of question and answers. So feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box throughout the event. Anytime you come up with a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box, and we'll answer all of the questions, or as many as we can, in the discussion at the end. So Dr. Martin Monti will be our first speaker. Dr. Monti is a professor in the departments of psychology and neurosurgery at UCLA. His research primarily focuses on the interplay between language and thought and consciousness and cognition as they relate to coma, vegetative states, and minimally conscious states following severe brain injury. His talk will specifically focus on losing consciousness following brain injury and what happens in the brain that leads to a loss or a recovery of consciousness. So I'm going to let Dr. Monti take it from here.
All right, well, good afternoon. It is really a pleasure to be here tonight and to discuss a little bit about what have we learned about consciousness. And in particular, let's see if I can also show my screen. Let's see. Sorry. You'd think after all this time, it'd be super easy for me to know how to share my screen. There we go. Okay, can I just get a thumbs up from someone that a screen with a big slide is visible?
It looks good to me.
All right, thank you very much. As I was saying, it's a pleasure to talk about some of the research that has been going on in my lab and in some of my collaborating labs, where we try to ask the question of what exactly is consciousness? Why does it get lost? Why do we lose it sometimes? And what is the difference between a brain that is capable of sustaining consciousness and a brain that might not? So, of course, you'd want to always start a discussion on the topic of consciousness by having a clear definition of consciousness is. And this in of itself is not very easy to do. But for the purposes of tonight, I will just tell you the way that I am talking about consciousness. And there might be many other ways of discussing consciousness, and they are probably equally valid, equally interesting. But this is what I mean when I'm talking about consciousness. And I'm going to be using the words of my colleague and friend Giulio Tononi, who says that consciousness is what vanishes every night when we fall into dreamless sleep and reappears when we wake up or when we have a dream experience. And if you think of it, really consciousness is all that we have, because as far as you are concerned, if you lose consciousness, then everything, the whole world and yourself vanish into nothingness. So I'm really referring to states of consciousness, meaning being conscious versus not being conscious. And this leads me to the first of the two questions I want to ask tonight. And it sounds like a very simple question intuitively to ask. If I were to ask you, are you conscious? What would you say? It probably takes you a fraction of a second to say, of course I'm conscious. And if I were to ask you, how do you know? You would probably say, well, I'm having an experience, right? Right now, you're having the experience of seeing certain images, of hearing certain sounds, right? You are experiencing what's happening around you. And this we refer to as consciousness. Fairly easy to do. What is much harder to do is for you to point at someone else and say, I'm sure that you are conscious with the same certainty. Because see, you don't have access to anybody else's subjective feeling of being conscious. You know, this might sound like a sort of a bit of an abstract and philosophical question, but actually it's very pragmatic. See, sometimes, and this, for example, happens to me, sometimes we are called to tell and judge whether someone else is conscious or is not conscious. And that is much harder. In my case, I study what are known as disorders of consciousness. Now, disorders of consciousness are a set of conditions typically acquired after a severe brain injury. So this could either be a traumatic brain injury in the case of an accident or a fall, or a non-traumatic brain injury. So they might be acquired after, for example, a stroke or near drowning, these kind of circumstances. And when this happens, after a severe brain injury, patients often enter the first disorder of consciousness, which is known as coma. And coma, you might be familiar with what that is. It's defined as a state of unarousable unresponsiveness. From our external point of view, patients in a coma look as if they were sleeping all the time. In fact, it's as if they were in a general anesthesia all the time. And they don't wake up even if you stimulate them. They don't give any sign, any response. Now, coma never lasts more than 3 to 4 weeks. And some patients recover and fully recover consciousness, and they have different levels of cognitive recovery in terms of the cognitive functions they're capable of doing. Now, a sliver of patients enter what is known as a vegetative state. Now, this is a very complex condition because these are patients who open their eyes, just as you're seeing in the picture right here. And their eyes open and close as if they were waking up and falling asleep every day. But they don't show any external sign of being conscious. And this is what is so difficult for us observers of these conditions. We are used to seeing if somebody has their eyes open and they're gazing somewhere, we tend to assume that they are seeing what they're looking at. In the case of these patients, they might be looking, but they're not seeing. They're not having an experience of seeing. They might be hearing a sound, but they're not listening. So these are patients that appear to be awake, but don't show any sign of being conscious. Finally, some patients remain in this condition the rest of their lives. Some of these patients instead recover the ability to tell you that they're conscious, and they enter what is known as a minimally conscious state. Now, back to the question, how do you know that someone is conscious? This is what is so difficult. Because in my case, I need to be able to tell the difference between a patient who wakes up and looks like they wake up and fall asleep periodically, open their eyes, sometimes does some kind of spontaneous movement, but is unconscious. And I have to distinguish that from a patient who looks very similar, but is at least minimally conscious. How do we do that? How do we tell apart these two situations? And this brings me back to the question, how do you know that, for example, me, how do you know that I'm conscious? Well, probably by now, you've inferred that I am, and I am. And the reason you've inferred that I am is because I'm responding to what's happening around me. Right? My behavior seems purposeful. I'm not just responding reflexively to what's around me. I seem to be an agent. My behavior is implying a state of consciousness. And this is how we tell if patients are conscious or not. I just want to give you two examples. In the what we do in the clinic is we ask patients, we try to elicit a response from a patient that would tell us that they are conscious. For example, you can see here the clinician is trying to elicit what is known as a startle reflex. And this patient is responding. And if you're in front of me, I would ask you, do you think this patient is conscious? Dramatic pause. At this point in time, just knowing that a patient does these kind of responses, blinks and responds to a stimulus, is not enough to know that they're conscious, because that's a reflex. We need something more convincing. So what we often do is we ask patients more complicated things. For example, follow this object with your eyes. And if the patient does it, then we infer that they are at least minimally conscious. They understood what we said, and they're trying to comply with what we asked. If the patient doesn't show any response, as is the case in this particular patient, then we think that we don't have any data to say that they're conscious. We think they are in a vegetative state. However, what if a patient were conscious, but just couldn't respond in a way that we could see it easily at the bedside? What if that patient had been conscious, but just couldn't move in a way sufficient that you and I could recognize it when she moves? And this is when myself and others got interested in using techniques such as neuroimaging. You might be familiar with MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, and other techniques to look at the brain directly. And maybe somebody is unable to respond with their body, with their muscles, to tell us they're conscious. Maybe they can respond, quote unquote, with their mind. Instead of asking them to, maybe to look somewhere, or to wiggle a toe, or to open their mouth, which are typical things that we ask these patients, maybe they can think of something and we can see it. And that's exactly what myself and others did. What you're seeing here is a magnetic resonance imaging, in fact, a functional magnetic resonance imaging image of somebody who's imagining playing tennis. So if you were right now, if you were to close your eyes and imagine playing tennis, and it doesn't matter if you know how to do it or not, just imagine swinging your arm back and forth to hit a ball. A certain part of your brain, known as the supplementary motor area, which is this part in the middle, would start being would start having very strong neural activity. And we see it with these orange and yellow colors. So these colors are marking parts of the brain that are particularly active. Now, if I were to ask someone to do this, and they do it, and I can see that their brain shows the activation in the parts of the brain that I'd expect to see, that means that you are responding. So maybe a patient is unable to, as I said, look somewhere, or wiggle a toe, or open their mouth, but maybe they can think of something when I ask them, and if they can, I can see it. So this is a new technique that we developed in order to tell if someone is conscious, even if they can't produce a behavior that is sufficient for us to look at and say, oh yes, this person must be conscious. In fact, it turns out that if you imagine playing tennis, this particular part of the brain, and in fact, if you imagined any kind of motor activity, complex motor activity, you would see a similar pattern of activation. But if I were to ask you to close your eyes, imagine being at the door of your home, and then imagine entering and visiting every single room in your house, and just imagining everything that you would see, a very different part of your brain would be active. It's a part of your brain that is deep in the middle of temporal cortex down here, known as the parahippocampal place area. And this is just because that part of the brain is particularly interested in sort of layouts and landscapes and things like that. So now I can actually ask someone to think of one thing or think of another, which means I can ask them a question. And I can say, look, if you want to say yes, imagine playing tennis. If you want to say no, imagine walking around the rooms of your home. And it turns out we could actually do this in some patients, and since other groups have replicated this finding. And if you think of it, if you can on command put your mind in different states, and I can see it, maybe we can train a computer to recognize your pattern of brain activity when you're imagining playing tennis or imagining walking around the rooms of your home. And you can use that to move a little cursor on a screen, to move it up in the case of this particular example, or to move it down. So you can see how we can leverage these kind of technologies in order to interface with these patients, even with somebody who does not have enough capacity to respond physically, motorically. Maybe we can give them another way of demonstrating that they're conscious. But wouldn't it be better if we could actually directly look at somebody's brain and tell, oh, this is a conscious brain? That would allow us not to have to ask them to do anything. We would just look at somebody's brain and tell if it's conscious or not. And this brings me to the second question, which is, what is the difference? Why do certain brains have experiences have experiences and are conscious? Why do other brains, for example, after a severe brain injury, not have such experiences? And to do this, I want to use an analogy to show the work of my good collaborator, Marcello Massimini and his group. And the analogy is the following. If I were to ask you, look around you, there's a wall in front of you or on your sides or behind you, right? There's a wall nearby you. If I were to ask you, how do you know if that wall is hollow or if it's full? What would you do? Probably you would knock on it, right? You'd knock on it and you listen for the sound that produces. If it's hollow, it produces a certain type of sound. If it's full, it produces a different type of sound. Now, we use exactly the same idea to knock on the brain and see what kind of sound or echo it produces. It turns out different states of consciousness produce different echoes. Let me give you an example. Okay? So this is an example of somebody. It's a reconstruction of somebody's head and brain. What we're going to do is we're going to, quote unquote, knock on the brain, which means we're going to use a technique known as transcranial magnetic stimulation. We ping the brain with a little bit of energy, all right? And we're gonna ping the brain right here. And then what you will see is you will see what happens to that energy. Now, what you see here is somebody who is conscious and is awake, just like you and I right now. So we ping, and you can see here the energy. Look what's going to happen. The energy is here, then it kind of moves a little bit in front. Then you're gonna see it go up here, it comes in the back. And as you see this energy, the echo of this energy that we injected in the brain, sort of it keeps reverberating. You keep hearing it and it keeps moving around in this network. And you see 300 milliseconds and the energy was still echoing in the system. That's because when we're conscious, our brain network is strongly integrated. Look at what happens when we fall asleep. Exactly same thing, okay? We inject the energy and two things happen. First, you're going to notice that the energy doesn't move around. It stays here all the time. See? It doesn't go in the front, it doesn't go in the back, it just stays here. Second, by 180 milliseconds, it's dissipated, it's gone. Why? Because when we are unconscious, the brain networks seem to sort of seem to flail out and are not as integrated. They seem to disintegrate when we are unconscious. Turns out, if you were to take a picture of these networks, and there are many ways of doing, I just want to show one. You and I would look like this. This funny haircut is just a way of showing how strong and complex the network of a healthy person who's awake is. And you can see sort of how complex, and you see these different colors. Those are an example of how different parts of the brain, different networks are talking to each other. A patient who's unconscious in a vegetative state, that's their network. It's a disintegrated network. And indeed, they're not capable of sustaining consciousness. A patient who's in a minimally conscious state, well, they have an extensive network that you're seeing right here, but look at the colors. See, they're all separated. It's because the different components of this network are not integrating and talking to each other. And so this is the difference between a conscious and a non-conscious brain. So to conclude, maybe one way of summarizing this, of what we're understanding today, of how consciousness works in the human brain, is that a state of consciousness is is not aware. It's not a single piece of your brain, and consciousness is in there. And if you scoop it out, you're not conscious anymore. It's more of a how your brain functions. If the network of your brain is well integrated and carries a lot of information, that is what is needed for a state of consciousness. And when this network disintegrates, well, that is what happens when individuals lose a state of consciousness. And thank you very much.
That was so great, Dr. Monti. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And now our next speaker, I'm muted, sorry. Anyway, that was really interesting. I think that was a really cool perspective on consciousness that, a topic that not a lot of us know a whole lot about. So I think next, Dr. Vucetic is going to be speaking about artificial intelligence, which I think is going to give another really interesting perspective to this consciousness discussion. Dr. Slobodan Vucetic is the director of the Center for Hybrid Intelligence, and he's a professor of computer science at Temple University. His research primarily focuses on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data science. His talk is going to focus on artificial intelligence, how we define intelligence, and whether intelligence is a requirement for consciousness, or if consciousness is a requirement for intelligence. So please take it away, Dr. Vucetic.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me see if I can share my screen quickly. Okay, can you see it?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. Okay. Okay, so my viewpoint will be from a viewpoint of a computer scientist. I'm really not a specialist in consciousness whatsoever, but I think I would like to talk about some potential links between consciousness and artificial intelligence, right? So in particular, can AI research inform consciousness research? I will repeat certain things of what Dr. Monti was saying. My source, so my knowledge comes from Wikipedia. I cannot believe that Wikipedia has some interesting information. So definitions are basically, I think a lot of definitions, obviously. I like this one kind of feeling of being alive. There are a lot of disclaimers. So even if you look at this basic Wikipedia article, it turns out that really nobody agrees about what consciousness is. And then some of those critiques go even farther to the level that somebody's saying, we kind of almost didn't do anything about consciousness, right? So the question is, why does anybody care about this topic? So obviously what Dr. Monti was talking about, there are practical reasons, in particular applications in medicine, the level of studying what is the mental state and what it means for disease and health. But I think kind of more philosophical perspective would be kind of knowledge discovery. And in a way, I think at the bottom of everything, it's really a question of who am I and what is my purpose. But then kind of becoming a little bit more specific, we are starting thinking, do we need a brain to be conscious? But can we be a worm? Or do we need to be intelligent? Or do we even need to be humans to be conscious? And very much related to that, if we start connecting consciousness to brain, there is this big question: is consciousness a natural phenomenon arising from brain structure and function, or it is a phenomenon that somehow is just related with brain? And then I guess at the bottom of everything, I think many people are interested in this topic partly because they kind of wonder what happens after they die, right? So what are two approaches in studying consciousness? Well, one approach I think is an internal approach, which is kind of belongs to abductive reasoning, which kind of goes like this. So I know I'm conscious, so I don't need anybody to tell me that. I'm sure in that, so it's an axiom. And then I look around and I see there are some other objects or entities that look like me and behave like me, and they're humans. And then I start concluding, okay, I'm human, and potentially these humans, other humans that look like me and walk like me and behave like me, are also conscious. So that would be an internal approach. And then kind of following this line of reasoning, I could kind of understand a lot about consciousness just thinking about my own experience. On the other hand, there is an external approach, which is scientific approach. So it's basically how, is it possible to derive a test that can check if an external object or entity is conscious? And unfortunately, this is a very elusive problem in general, mostly because exactly the problem of ground truth. So how do we know that an object that we are studying is in fact conscious, and what is actually the definition of it? What I found very interesting, and this will be a segue to now the second part of my discussion, very often I'm seeing that the people mention a famous test of artificial intelligence as a test that might serve to reveal if somebody's conscious or not. So basically, there is a line of research, I suppose, in kind of consciousness area that kind of likes to connect consciousness with intelligence. So let's kind of see what is artificial intelligence. So this is the area where I'm spending my time in. It is really about a software that might be embedded in a material object like a robot, with the ability to correctly interpret external data or external signals, and then to learn from such data, and eventually to use what was learned to achieve specific goals and tasks through flexible adaptation. It turns out that the most recent success in artificial intelligence, so if you're reading about AI in popular press, you will actually mostly read about something that's called deep learning, which is a branch of artificial intelligence that tries to build artificial brains. And what you see on the left is basically that the brain is really mechanistically consisted of neurons, and artificial brain is kind of trying to do the same. It creates artificial neurons and connects a lot of them together in a structure that is trying kind of to imitate what real brains are doing. Okay. So what is the end point? Well, the end point, I think it's been defined in 1950s, right? It's kind of defined as a holy grail of artificial intelligence, which is called the Turing test. And the Turing test is really an imitation game. So the point is, if a human can detect if a conversation is with another human or a computer. So you see this at the bottom, human C is talking across a wall with either object A or object B. One of them is human, another one is a computer. At the moment when a human C cannot recognize anymore who they are talking with, this is a moment when AI passed the Turing test. And in fact, actually, very recent results, the very recent advances in AI are giving something that you see in this box here that I call GPT-3. This is an actual conversation between an actual human and the state-of-the-art AI. And then if you kind of read it, you will see it starts looking like something that might arise from conversation between two humans. Okay? But there are also technical issues, and I think those technical issues hold some lessons for studying of consciousness. So Turing test sounds really cool in practice, but there are technical issues in how do we even perform this experiment. So in fact, what is the conversation about? Is it about facts, opinions, logical reasoning, creativity? Are we asking the other entity to create poems and stuff like that? Is it about feelings? Are we asking the other entity, how do you feel today? Right? Another question is, who is the judge? Right? So because different humans are different, so we might hear different opinions. And then, in fact, kind of the weakness of Turing tests is basically that it is subject to cheating. In fact, this is really an imitation problem. Right? So we are asking this other entity to really pretend to be a human. Okay? So what is going on with our quest towards the Turing, passing Turing test? Well, the progress is really, really rapid. So this is one example that's related to self-driving cars. You probably read about it. So this is really an artificial intelligence embedded in a car that is supposed to be able to navigate through physical space, right? And one big component of self-driving cars is the ability to sense and process information and even learn, and then make plans and then execute those plans in real time. A similar example is, I like this one, a company called Boston Dynamics. They post really cool videos on YouTube, so you can check them. It sounds very, very impressive. You can almost believe that those robots are like real. I wanted again to mention those chatbots. So this is, I think, very, very closely related to the Turing test. And you can see this again example of the conversation. And there are lot of other really in just recent years advancements that are showing that progress in AI is really astronomical in recent years. Just to kind of demonstrate that, so here I'm kind of demonstrating it through what a neural network could do just a few years ago. So we have an example here of an image created in 2014 by a state-of-the-art AI software in generating fake images. And then you see what happened just 4 years later. This fake image now generated by an AI software is almost so realistic that we would believe this is a real person. Similar thing happened here at the bottom in 2012. This is kind of like the best that artificial intelligence could do in generating text. And you see just a few years later, this is actually now something that AI can generate that sounds eerily close to what a human actually would do. Okay. So where are we now in this quest towards passing the Turing test, right? So it turns out that we are progressing, but there are still a lot of weaknesses that are related to some fundamental issues related to trying to build an artificial brain. So the question is, what will happen in the future? Well, apparently people are kind of in two camps. One camp says never, which means we will never have an AI agent that's passing the Turing test. And another camp is saying, well, sooner than we think. And an example, actually, this conversation that you've just seen, it was generated by a particular artificial brain that has 175 billion parameters. And it turns out that this number of parameters is comparable to the ability of a mouse brain. So actually mouse brain architecture is kind of comparable to GPT-3, right? So what the story is actually, if we are currently here in 2020, and then just about 20 years ago, the best artificial brains were at the level of worms, potentially we could kind of slowly creep into the human brain territory. And then potentially we could reach this point of this amazing change from chimpanzee brain to a human brain to gaining certain abilities that simply did not exist before, right? So I think what happens beyond the Turing test, so if you ever could pass it, what are the next questions? Well, the next questions are consciousness, right? So would these intelligent artificial agents be able to be conscious? And even worse, some people fear about singularity, which is ability of that agent to reprogram and improve itself until infinity. The point is that both aspects are still largely speculative. There is no scientific basis to discuss it, and still in the realm of science fiction, right? So that's, I think, where we are right now. But I kind of wanted to use now the last few minutes of this presentation to talk about maybe my view of relationships between AI and consciousness, right? So those modern artificial brains that you've seen, they have some interesting properties. One of their properties is that they are deep, which means that the signal that they receive is getting transmitted through a cascade of neurons before those artificial brains are ready to do anything or make any decision. Okay? The artificial brains actually also have power of representation, which is representing the raw signals from the environment as mathematical and even abstract concepts. And we are starting to see some interesting behaviors that we can almost equate with dreaming or creating or playing games or solving complex problems. And I'll show you a couple of examples. The deep is one of the keywords. Well, it turns out that our brains, in fact, are deep. So anything or any kind of thought that we have usually is created by going through at least 10 hops, hopping through 10 different layers of neurons. Anything less than that apparently is not generating any complex thoughts. So it turns out that actually this is something that the recent successes, we are starting to become able to actually generate those artificial brains that have a lot of layers. And then the big question is, if we are actually building those artificial brains, are they slowly gaining some abilities for deep thinking? And eventually, is this something that has to do with consciousness, right? So I just have 2 more slides. So this is something related with representations. I just want to kind of maybe point this example at the bottom. So this is a neural network that's looking at the image of a tiger. And then what we are seeing at the bottom, those three boxes, they're literally something that we can call neuroimaging. So this is actually when we put some probes in those artificial brains, and then we observe that those artificial brains are actually seeing the particular patterns. And then at the lower level of that brain, they're seeing this horizontal, vertical, and diagonal stripes. But then at the next levels of that artificial brain, we are starting to see more complicated patterns and something that even starts looking like objects from the real world. And then kind of as my basically last slide, I want to actually show you some evidence that the artificial brains are kind of starting to gain ability to dream. And these are some 3 pictures that I just picked up from internet that actually point to kind of what those artificial brains are thinking about and what are they seeing, right? So, so I think obvious question is, what does that now mean, right? So this progress is again really astronomical. What it means, well, I think my point that I'm trying to make is that there are really interesting links between intelligence and consciousness. I think that AI research, especially recent research in artificial brains, or what people also call it deep learning, can potentially be useful in understanding consciousness. And so I think also recent AI progress brings this promise of reaching general human intelligence. So with all that, I think, again, this is probably an area of potential future interesting research and making some interesting connections. But at the current moment, still there is very little research at the intersection between AI and consciousness. So with that one, I would conclude my talk. Thanks for the attention.
All right. Well, thank you very much. As I thought, that is another really interesting perspective on consciousness, and kind of something, coming from a neuroscience background, a perspective that I hadn't really had before. So thank you. So we're going to move now to our panel discussion, our question and answer session. And we have some questions coming in already. So I'm looking through some questions on Zoom as well as those tuning in on Facebook Live. So let's start with one for Dr. Monti. John Flynn asks, how much do you think language is important for consciousness? Does human ability to work symbolically have a strong influence on the variance of consciousness experiences, or is language epiphenomenal to the experiences of consciousness?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because language feels like such a big part of our of what's going on in our mind most of the time. So it does feel like language is at the center of who we are for sure. I do not think, however, language per se plays an important role of consciousness. The example I would give is that patients who lose the ability for language, be it because they lose the ability either to express, in the case of sort of Broca's area, and sort of also to understand some parts of language, or so-called fluent aphasia, they lose the ability to process language and to use language, but they do seem conscious in terms of the state. They do. I'd have no quarrel saying that they clearly are conscious. Of course, the contents of their experience are different because they just cannot use these little verbal tokens that we use to synthesize concepts and sort of information. So no doubt that it feels probably different in the sense of what is available to your conscious self, but I don't think that losing language would make someone unconscious in that sense. And there certainly are many examples in the pathological domain, in the clinical domain, sorry, of loss of language without loss of a state of consciousness. Although I recognize it would change what are the contents that can go on inside that state of consciousness, for sure.
Great, thank you. And then actually we have a question also from John Flynn, now for Dr. Vucetic. He says, you mentioned in passing that neural nets were black boxes, that we don't understand what they mean, they just work. What is the research on figuring out the underlying meaning of neural network patterns, or is that even a solvable problem in your view?
So yeah, there is a lot of talk, if you kind of go and talk to specialists in deep learning and AI, that artificial brains are black boxes. But I think what it means, in fact, that they're the same black boxes as our brains are. So there is kind of no obvious or easy way to understand what those brains are thinking. But there is, on the other hand, a very easy way to probe every little connection in that artificial brain or any group of connections. So that's those images that I showed at the end, those are actually obtained by kind of neuroimaging of those brains. I think what you probably are kind of more interested in is in a question of explainability, which means neural networks will make decisions, right? Or for different things, like whatever they serve for. For example, they'll make a decision whether to steer a car to the left or to the right, right? So if you ask a human why you were steering left in this particular situation, you will usually hear a description, right? You will hear some justification why the car turned left. On the other hand, with neural networks, it's still not obvious how do we actually ask neural networks about what they were thinking about. But I'm also kind of remembering, I read something about kind of those explanations by human brains, also by humans, when you ask them why it turned left. Well, it turns out that this is kind of done post hoc. So basically, person first steers left, and then if you ask for explanation, then the human brain actually comes up with a story that is consistent with the action. So at that level, my conclusion is kind of human brains and the artificial brains are almost kind of at the same level of being a black box. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer.
Although it doesn't make them any more similar.
Yeah, exactly.
Just make them both equally mysterious.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, and that it doesn't make sense, I guess. All right, we actually now have a question for both of you, and we would love to have both of your perspectives on it. Gabe Myers asks, can an individual successfully self-evaluate their own consciousness, whether that individual is a human or an artificial construct, or is external observation necessary to ensure the conclusion is valid? I think, why don't we start with Dr. Monti, and then we'll go to Dr. Vucetic.
Well, at risk of being too self-important, I don't think external observation is necessary. In fact, I think the only thing we have is self-observation. We're working very hard to get sort of third-person observation, which sort of, for some of the pragmatic reasons that I mentioned, is important, but it extends to the question of neural networks, artificial, sort of other biological entities, so other species and non-biological entities. So it's important to develop that, but the only thing I have is the knowledge that I am having this experience. That I'll take it back to that.
Yeah, I would think I'm definitely less educated in answering that question. So again, any answer that I will now give you comes exactly from that internal perspective, so which actually each one of us can give. I think this is really probably one of the biggest questions that humanity might have, I think technology is not necessarily there. Probably partly because you could put an argument that actually consciousness and mind, it may be something that's not necessarily physically measurable, right? And then it kind of goes into this into religions and everything else, right? Again, I'm just talking about as an uninformed outsider about those questions. But on the other hand, I believe probably all of us are kind of uneducated outsiders when it comes to many questions about consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I'm learning the most that I have ever known about consciousness at this very moment. So, all right, we've got another question for Dr. Vucetic. David on Zoom asks, what do you think of John Searle's Chinese room critique of the idea of machine intelligence or consciousness?
So I kind of read about it, but you will need to remind me of what it is.
I think that's a provocative question. I think I have a vague recollection of it. I think the idea is, if you imagine somebody being locked in a room and they were fed information from the outside, this was about something that the person inside would know nothing. I think the example was Chinese characters. But if the person inside, you can see a case where the person inside learns how to map the input to the output without knowing anything about Chinese, but from the outside, it would look like as if they had learned Chinese. So I think the criticism is meant to say, just because something can imitate, a behavior or sort of state, is that sufficient to? I think that's what they are provocatively asking you.
Sure. And then so thanks for explaining. So I think this is exactly what I think current state of the art in AI is. We're really building imitation machines. So it's nothing more than that. I don't believe for 1 second that those artificial constructs, artificial intelligence software has any inkling of being conscious about what it's doing. So so at that level, there is almost no question. The question is, looking in the future, if you really start building those machines that can pass the Turing test, I would say this is still not sufficient. I would like to see a proof that those machines are aware, probably, of themselves, right? Or kind of can reason. But then if you think, how do you reach that state of being a reasonable entity, right? I think there needs to be something else that's really missing from AI, which is a reason. So the reason for existence, or why. I think we as living beings, we have something ingrained that tells us we want to live. And that's probably one of the basic feeling. And another thing, this consciousness, just the fact that we say we think we exist. Those two are driving forces that actually, I guess, we all have. But in AI, these ingredients, they're not there. And AI is doing great without those two ingredients. But that's why it's still, I think, artificial. And I'm kind of leaning towards that camp that says AI will never be conscious, or actually AI will never be equal to humans. Maybe it might be superior in certain things, but not equal to humans.
I mean, if you take one of those small, silly, sun-powered calculators, they can totally outsmart us at the simplest things, right? And yet we can do these other things that are so hard to code. That's, to me, one of the most mysterious things. How does our brain achieve things that we are having a hard time getting a computer to do, and vice versa? Can I ask, Slobodan, your take on this particular problem? Because I think about it often, but if I could tell you that as a neuroengineer, let's say I become a neuroengineering, and now I take your brain and I change, you might be familiar with the problem, I change every single neuron with an exact replica that does the exact same thing, but it's made of non-biological material. But still, and we replace them one at a time. Would you think you're having an experience? And there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just honestly asking for what you think.
So I heard about it. I thought about it. So that's kind of that mechanistic approach. If you can just copy paste every atom, right, in the brain, well, one of the differences is actually artificial brains are not even functioning. I mean, the physics of artificial brains is not the physics of human brains. I guess brains are processing electric kind of signals, right? And artificial brains are processing numbers. It just kind of, at the end of the day, those behaviors sometimes appear related. Again, I kind of what I would be thinking, potentially that artificial machine could replicate certain behaviors, but I think there would be exactly those missing ingredients. What I think kind of missing ingredient is actually, am I alive, right? Am I aware? And I think the truly scary vision that I think some people kind of are afraid of is that just building that machine, this consciousness just arises from the physics of that object, right? So I think some inklings of that, again, this last slide, when you saw that these neural networks are literally dreaming or hallucinating, these are, some people might think, oh wow, this is a scary thing, are we kind of, what's happening? But somehow I think it's still just kind of, again, we are kind of hopeful, we are showing some correlations between human brain and AI, but
I agree with you. We are anthropomorphizing what they do. I agree entirely with you. And I fall in your same camp in terms of what's likely to happen or not. I'm sorry, I just want to get your take.
Apparently, we should have had a dreaming expert on the panel as
yes.
well. Okay, that was a really great discussion. Thank you guys for that. We have a couple more questions. This is kind of a two-parter. First part is for Dr. Monti. Olivia Simmons asks, what happens to consciousness or the brain under the influence of mind-altering drugs? And then sort of a follow-up for Dr. Vucetic. Could altered or expanded states of consciousness like this ever be replicated in AI?
All right, I'll take the first part.
Yes,
The second part is too hard for me, so I'm glad. I'm glad that was not for me. It's really interesting. So I would answer the first part this way. I would say, obviously, there's a way of manipulating the human brain to change your state of consciousness. You're under general anesthesia, you're out. So we've manipulated your state of consciousness. I think Olivia is asking us about what happens. Can you modify the contents of your consciousness, which is how I typically think of mind-altering drugs. Typically, what you're doing is, at least sort of what seems to be happening, is that just the representations that go into your consciousness are different from the type of representations that go into your daily consciousness. And so that gives you that sort of feeling of living things differently and perceiving things differently, and gives you different, I would see that as having different contents that are unusual. If you think of it a bit like when you're having dreams, often their contents tend to be very bizarre and very unusual. And it seems to me that you can think of mind-altering compounds as inducing those kind of slightly different type of representations in your state of consciousness. It seems to me that those drugs tend to act on what are you conscious of and how are you conscious of things. So you can think of sort of two ways of manipulating your consciousness. Some ways we can make you in or out, and other ways we can just change the representations that go into your state of consciousness.
So yeah, from my point of view, so I'm kind of seeing those any kind of mind-altering synthetic kind of materials or not synthetic, natural. What I think you're doing, you're messing up with the connections, right? So in the language of neural networks, you're messing also with the connections, which we call kind of weights. And in a sense, you're temporarily messing up with the architecture of the brain itself. And now the question is, where are you messing up? Are you messing up at the lower level of processing, or you're messing up at the higher level of processing? And I think in artificial neural networks, we are actually kind of aware of those things. So I could think, if you're, for example, drunk, you could still, your vision system still works. So I would state, lower kind of level and processing is still kind of intact almost. But what you have problem is actually with the high level things like basically fine motor control and maybe some kind of fine decision making, right? And with some other drugs, you might actually change even the way how you hallucinate, right? Or how you perceive the world. So again, I don't know much about drugs. I'm sure you know much better. But I think I could see kind of analogs in neural networks. And actually, we are doing in our research, we are messing up with those things. In fact, when we are training our brains, we actually have a ways. Sometimes we want to mess up with those higher level parts of the brain. Sometimes we actually need to mess up with the lower level kind of processing things.
Great, thank you. Let me see here. What else have we got? So this is a question for Dr. Vucetic from Sarah on Facebook, but I sort of have a follow-up for Dr. Monti as well. Sarah asks, as humans learn and develop and gain intelligence, they can think, adapt, and respond more quickly and efficiently. Does this deep learning or AI get smarter over time and experience? And sort of follow up for Dr. Monti on that, in patients who might lose consciousness or be in some sort of vegetative state, is there an opportunity for them to sort of regrow this consciousness throughout by having experiences and things like that? So let's start with Dr. Vucetic with that question.
Sure. So I'm not 100% sure I'll be answering exactly what the question is about, but again, I see an answer in the way how we train artificial brains. So we usually start with a baby brain. So we would just basically say, this is your God-given architecture, right? Your neurons and connections, but we are not saying how strongly the connections are, how strong they are. And then we start learning. So in initial stages, this brain is really it has a huge entropy, I would say. So it's very still not sure what to do, right? And then as the learning actually progresses and we can measure it, it becomes more and more ordered, more and more we're reducing entropy. So certain connections are becoming stronger, and a lot of other connections are disappearing. So in a sense, as you keep training those neural networks, once they start really building capability to recognize people on images and stuff like that, they really start almost getting some kind of structure. And then, I guess extrapolating from there, there might be some analog with how actually human brain is constructed, right? So it's not just a random connection of neurons.
I'm sorry, what was the follow-up? I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah, my question
I was just listening. I was totally the answer, and I forget.
Yeah, my question was so if we're saying that AIs can learn as they and grow as they learn,
can patients
relearn as well through experience?
No, so, very timely question. We are actually developing ways to try to help patients regain consciousness. And as I said, I think consciousness is best thought of a how in the brain, but undoubtedly there are parts of the brain that are important for that how. There are some parts of the brain without which it's very hard to have the how. I just don't think that those parts of the brain have consciousness in them, but they allow the rest of the brain to function as an integrated network. So there are some ways in my laboratory, for example, we're using non-invasive focused ultrasound to try to get those particular neurons inside of the brain to get them back into action and to get them back at a higher level of functioning, which is one important node of this network. So without certain important nodes, just the network can't function in that integrated way. And we're trying to get those nodes of the network to restart their function with non-invasive neurotechnology. So yes, I think we are. We don't understand it well enough to understand all the conditions, but yes, we're trying.
That's really interesting. I wonder if there would be a way to mimic that with AI as well, knock out one of the nodes in AI and then see if you can fix it externally somehow.
There is, in fact, I think human artificial brains have a completely different type of a problem, which actually we are struggling with in our research, which is called catastrophic forgetting. So
that sounds very bad.
Yeah, so those brains, basically you teach them something, and then once the new information starts coming, they have a tendency to forget what happened before and focus on new experiences. So they constantly are regrowing themselves and reinventing themselves, which I think is probably so different from human brains, when in fact they actually become, I guess the older the brain there is, the connections are more stable, and then it becomes very hard to undo what was done and maybe even start learning new skills and so on and so on. So I think that's a really stark contrast between those two types of.
But it's interesting, right? Because you could create a system that starts out with, I wouldn't say empty, because it needs to know some things. It needs to know how to learn, for example. And then over time, it just slowly crystallizes. And then just the amount of information that it needs in order to modify any weight, that would be somewhat akin to at least some aspect of, the human brain does have critical periods for learning certain things. And that'd be I'm sure somebody must be working on that.
Cool. All right, we've got, I think, 2 more questions. I'll start with the short one first. Anonymous asks for Dr. Vucetic, but they say maybe both. Is there any relationship between the richness of vocabulary and the capacity to expand abstract thinking?
Yes, I'm doing just a little bit of research in natural language processing, and again, I think those neural networks, the artificial ones, are becoming really better and better in understanding human language or even generating, right? On the other hand, I think still it's really at the level of imitation game. So it's very easy to derive ways how to trick neural networks in doing something really silly. And then in that way, they demonstrated that actually they don't have a clue what's going on. So that would be my answer.
Dr. Monti, do you have any
No,
perspective?
I think, I mean, I agree entirely sort of with Slobodan's point of view. No doubt that things like vocabulary allows, the beauty of language and words is that it allows to capture fairly complex concepts in an easy way to either operate upon or convey to someone else. But I don't necessarily think it is necessary or sort of plays a key role in the context of consciousness. But certainly, it'd be hard to think about justice if we didn't have the word justice. It'd be, I mean, if I were to describe what justice is, it'd take me 20 minutes. So there's no doubt that the efficiency of words plays an important role in intelligence and abstract thinking.
So maybe language modulates consciousness, but not necessarily
certainly allows
necessary for it.
Right. It certainly allows for some contents to be encoded and treated in a very efficient way, no doubt.
Great. All right. We've got one final question for the two of you. It's a bit long, so let me know if you need it repeated at all. Susan Phillips says, I am gathering from this presentation that consciousness is a product of the brain. But could you also say that an integrated brain is not producing consciousness? Rather, it is capable of accessing consciousness, and a disintegrated brain cannot access it. In other words, could you say that consciousness exists at all times, but is more or less accessible to an individual depending on the health and integration of the brain?
That's interesting. It sounds like the kind of question that Nikola Tesla would have asked, because he had this theory that energy exists and it's just a matter of tapping into it. And that's a compliment, Susan, because being compared to Nikola Tesla can only be a huge compliment. I have to say that I think I'm a very where I'm at today is that I'm very materialistic. And I do think that consciousness is generated in the brain and exists in the brain. When the evidence will change in favor of a broader, also the consciousness that I am talking about in terms of these states, I think that exists in the brain and is produced by the brain. There might be other ways of understanding consciousness that might be sort of relate to other aspects, but the specific type of consciousness that I've been discussing, I think starts and ends with the human brain.
Great answer. Dr. Vucetic, do you have any input?
I could just reflect that, and I think kind of what maybe I wanted to say, this is kind of where this question is placed where probably science ends, and then philosophy or I guess religion or metaphysics enters. So I think what kind of we want to keep in mind that we as humanity, right, we have many questions, and science is the one way how we know how to get to the truth. It just seems to me that there's a lot of those questions related to consciousness are just currently beyond the reach of the human abilities of human technology. We just don't want to forget that just a few hundred years ago we were really very, very different, really living in a different world, right? In a world that was not necessarily scientific, right? So I think I'm kind of very exciting for future generations and for other generations too, for future, to keep advancing science and maybe one day start answering those really big questions that are currently beyond the reach.
Great. Yeah. All right. So I think that about wraps it up. This has been a really interesting conversation. I'm very glad that we recorded it because I think I'm going to have to go back and rewatch everything to better understand consciousness myself. So just some final thank yous. Thank you so much to Dr. Monti and Dr. Vucetic for providing such great insight into this mystery of consciousness. Thank you, of course, to Taste of Science and the whole Taste of Science Philadelphia team who has made this event work behind the scenes. And of course, thank you to everyone who attended and asked such incredible questions. So again, if you had a great time and you'd like to make a donation, feel free to go to tasteofscience.org/donate. We would really appreciate it. I really hope that everyone enjoyed the event, and be sure to keep an eye out for all of our future Taste of Science events, both virtual and hopefully very soon in person again. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you all, and thank you for the great questions.
Yeah, thank you.